Hello everybody, welcome to 2025. It's an exciting new year. I hope that it's starting off well for all of you too. And I hope that this is the year perhaps where you actually get started with looking for your Akiya in Japan. Wanted to talk a little bit in this episode about problems that may come up with properties that you look into or that you want to buy in Japan. And I have quite a list of problems that can come up, but this is only scratching the surface. So you really need to be aware, especially Akiya house sales are, basically as is. So there's not a lot of guarantees. Sellers have different levels of motivation. Sometimes they just really want to get rid of the property quick. They don't want to look at it. They don't want to see it. They don't want to see what's in it. They certainly don't want to go through the material and see what they want to save and see what they want to throw away. They just want to sell the whole thing lock, stock, and barrel. That's one kind of seller. And then there's the other kind of seller, which is very, very worried about the community and very, very worried about the reputation of the family, and that, they're making sure that the new buyer is going to work out with the community. And both of these types of sellers are really, really common in Japan. So you can get kind of two extremes, and sometimes you can get both of those extremes in the same seller. And so it can be kind of challenging sometimes to just figure out how to buy the land that you're interested in buying. So let's talk about those types of problems. So one of the big motivators, I think, for sellers is obviously getting rid of the property. A lot of times it has belonged to somebody else in their family, or it may be even their parents' home or their grandparents' home, or some kind of relative. They don't really have any ties to the community themselves. They don't know people around. They're very uninterested in the place. They have no intention of coming around to the place. They don't care what's in it, etc. And those houses a lot of times have been vacant for sometimes a number of years. And you really want to find out exactly how long the house has been vacant. For the most part, Japanese will tend to leave houses vacant for a minimum of 2 years. This is kind of a traditional thing. You don't want to just sell the house right out from under the memory of maybe your grandparents passing or your parents passing or something like that. And so Japanese will often hold on to a house for 2 or 3 years after the passing of the person who was living there. And this could be even longer, because very often those people were in maybe a home or some other facility for a couple of years before that. So, it could be 4, 5, 6, 10 years that someone has last lived in the house. And so you really want to know when that house became vacant, because, that's going to matter for a lot of things. Had there been problems that nobody's noticed? Maybe there's some leaks that no one knew about, but they sprung during that 10-year period. You want to pay attention to how long the house has been vacant. The longer the house has been vacant, certainly I would suggest that the more important it is to have an inspection, so you can really have a second set of eyes that are looking closely at it. So on that side, the seller is often very, very motivated just simply to get rid of the house as soon as possible. And there's a good possibility you may never even meet or encounter the seller. But then there's the opposite extreme, which is the seller that has some relationship to the community. Maybe the parents were a big part of the community, or grandparents, or uncle or aunt, or whatever. Maybe they grew up in the community, or something that has given them some tie to the community. That means they're going to be really concerned about whether the buyers are suitable to the neighborhood. There's a problem, frankly, with foreign buyers, because there's a tendency to assume that foreign buyers will not be suitable to the neighborhood. And the reason for that is because small town Japan does get complicated. There's a lot of community spirit. There's a lot of community activities. There's a lot of community expectations. And if the foreigners are going to move into that community and not respect those responsibilities, not get involved in the community, not do their part, that's obviously going to tug at the fabric of the community, and the community leaders and just basically the neighbors don't really want that. And so sometimes these sellers are going to give you an interview. They're going to talk to you a little bit, find out how suitable you are for the community. What are you going to do with the facility? Say you're going to make it into some kind of guest house or something like that, a lodge. Well, okay, maybe that's okay, maybe that's not okay. Or, officially it's okay. Maybe the city says it's okay, the zoning says it's okay, but the neighbors, they're not okay with it. And that seller might be interviewing you for that sort of thing. So you really want to make it a good impression in those cases. I recommend, bringing gifts for the seller even. Certainly be on time for the meeting. Be, on your best behavior. Dress nicely. All of those types of things are really important to make a good impression with the seller if the seller wants to interview you. The seller can decide who they sell it to. They don't have to have any reason to sell or reason not to sell. They simply decide, and it's their decision. And so this is something to definitely keep in mind as you go into your attempt to purchase a property. And when you get into the small towns, a lot of sellers are concerned about how you are going to integrate and how your ideas are going to integrate with that small town. Another aspect with the seller is how the seller is working with the real estate agent that is representing the house. Some sellers, especially local sellers, will list with several agents. This isn't really a good idea from a seller's perspective because generally speaking, if so, the agents aren't very motivated to sell the house because they're like, well, who's going to sell it? There's no law that says that a house has to be listed exclusively with one agent. So certain people will just list with several agents. They'll list with a national agent and they'll list with a local agent. And, maybe the local agent is their friend or something like that. And that's actually a good reason to befriend local agents. National agents are definitely less motivated in general, but also they may be very unmotivated when they're competing against a local agent. So they simply are just like, well, whatever, we aren't really going to put a lot of effort into selling this house. The local agent will probably get the credit for it anyway, and it's hardly worth our time. So there is definitely a lack of motivation that can spring up from the seller listing with multiple agents. One of the ways you can find that manifested is how the listing looks on the websites, because if you look at different websites that have the same listing, they might look very different. They might have different photos. They might have different explanations. Some might be very thorough, and others will have like 2 or 3 pictures that are terrible. A telltale sign of when a buyer is listing with multiple agents is when there's 2 or 3 pictures and not much of a description. So you might want to look and see if you can find where the local agent might be that's representing that house. Now, they might look the same, and that's fine, but they might be a lot more thorough. This is actually not a bad thing because sometimes you can find some great diamonds in the rough in those houses that are not well represented. That doesn't mean they're ugly inside necessarily. It could mean that, but it could mean that they're just not being very well represented. And so if you see a house has 2 or 3 pictures, it looks okay, maybe there's something in there, you might want to check it out. And you might want to look for that local agent who is listing the house in addition to the national agent. But either way, even if you can only find one agent that's listing, that's no problem. You can contact that agent and see the house, and they'll certainly try to sell it to you. Other seller problems. This has come up with us a few times. Sometimes the seller doesn't own the house, and that means that they are actually selling it for a family member, usually a parent. And that parent might be in some way incapacitated. Of course, the biggest one is dementia or Alzheimer's, that sort of thing, because that's a mental incapacitation. And Japanese law says that if somebody is alive and they own a house, they have to sell the house. Their family can't sell it unless they have power of attorney. Well, I suppose that law is probably the same almost anywhere. Well, a lot of times, especially in these small towns and villages, people don't get the power of attorney. They don't even know they need to get the power of attorney. They don't know they can't sell the house for their family because everything's family oriented and community oriented. Well, you go through the steps and then you find out you can't buy the house. I've actually gone so far as to sign an intent to buy and go into negotiations, do an interview with the seller and get that far before discovering that the seller has no right to sell the house. It actually belonged to his mother. His mother's still alive. She has dementia. She is in no condition to be able to approve the sale, but yet he can't sell the house. So you can go pretty far along that road without discovering. So that's something you want to probably look into right away. Another example of a surprising situation with a landowner that I dealt with was a seller was trying to sell a house for their deceased parents. And so that was no problem. They had the right. They owned the house. But what we didn't know was that they didn't actually own the land. Now, the land was not leased, and that'll happen sometimes, leased land. And you want to watch out for that. But in this case, the land wasn't leased. It was owned by another family member. And so those two couldn't come together. And as a result, the house couldn't be sold because one family member owned the house, another family member owned the property. And so sometimes there's a disconnect there. Interestingly, in that situation, I think that the family member who owned the house didn't even know about the family member who owned the land, didn't know there was a problem, found out when everything sort of started to get unpacked, and then went to that family member to discuss, but they hadn't seen each other in years. Things didn't go well. The house did end up being relisted, but at 3 times the price. And of course the land was being sold with it. Still wasn't a bad deal, and it was oceanfront land. So not a bad deal at all, but it certainly wasn't the deal that was originally laid out. So that was a little bit disappointing. In my case, we didn't buy that because it wasn't what we were looking for. It's quite a bit of land, oceanfront. Probably would have been perfect for a different type of developer, but it wasn't what we were looking for. You want to be sure that the landowner has approved the sale of the house, whoever that landowner is, and you're going to want to make sure that you don't buy a house and a land separately. You want to make sure that that is all worked into a single plan so that you can make sure that both go through smoothly. And that brings me to the final topic that I wanted to discuss today, which is if the land or the house has a lien on it. And this has also happened to me, so this is personal experience. A lien is basically maybe some kind of loan that was taken out by a previous owner of the house that is still on the record for the house. And that means that that loan has to be cleared up or paid off in order to have the house title free and clear. It's actually registered onto the house title that, you know, there was a loan taken out against the value of the house. Well, in the case of a house that I was looking at a couple of years ago, there was a lien on the house that was about 120 years old, maybe older. I can't remember exactly how old it was, but it was still on the record of the house. Well, the house had been kept in that same family for, you know, generations, and so they'd forgotten about the lien. They didn't have any idea that the lien existed, and it was a 120-year-old lien. Nobody even knew who the other people were who were involved in the lien, but because it was still there, it was preventing the sale of the house, or not exactly preventing, but basically it meant that if I were to buy the house, I was going to have to take on the responsibility of that lien. And no bank is going to ever consider loaning money for land or for a house that has a lien on it. It's just, it's bad business, obviously. And so even if that lien is 120 years old, it's still there. And so the banks are certainly going to shy away from that. And that also means that you're going to have trouble selling that house when it comes time to sell, unless you take care of that lien. This is a kind of a huge thing because sooner or later you probably are going to want to sell the house. And if you don't get rid of that lien, then the house is difficult, not impossible, close to impossible to sell. or even just the land, even if you tear down the house, but the land is impossible to sell. And so that means you got to track people down. You got to track families down, hired private investigators, whatever. Now, on top of that, the family could say, no, we want you to pay up on that lien. There's no record that it's been paid. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't, we don't know. But according to the record, the house is still up against the lien. Now, 120-year-old lien was only for like 200 yen, I think. But the problem is 200 yen was worth a lot more money in those days. And the banks or the government will look at the value that it was then in today's yen, in today's dollar, well, today's money. That means that even though it was a 200 yen loan, I think that, I can't remember what the numbers were, but it was more like, 2 million yen today, $20,000 or something like that. And so that's a substantial chunk of money that has to be taken care of. And so this is very complicated. If the lien is not easy to take care of, and they usually aren't, if the lien is not easy to take care of, probably best not to buy the house with the lien. So that's a few of the seller's problems that I wanted to get into a little bit in depth in this particular episode. So in the next episode, I want to get into some problems, not so much with the seller, but with the actual house, or maybe with the deed, or maybe with the land. Things like boundaries I talked about in the last episode. I'll get into the detail a little bit in that. Are they registered? Are they not registered? Are there shared boundaries? Are there places where people have built on your land or you've built on their land? Those are real potential problems, obviously. Also access to the road. Can you get into the land? A lot of houses that don't have access can be big problems for tearing down or rebuilding, etc. Get into that a little bit. Do you have a septic tank, or can you connect to the public sewer system, water system, or your well? Sometimes you even have to deal with a well. Natural gas or delivered gas, kerosene heaters. I mean, all of these things. So the utilities or the power of the house can also be a huge issue. So I'll get into all of that in the next episode, but thank you very much for joining me. I'm so sorry this one was so late, but I'll try to keep a much more regular schedule in 2025. So thanks.